And yeah, the floor is yours, Malte.
Okay, so you said something like 10 minutes or something, 10 minutes, 15 minutes to give an input?
Yeah, 15 minutes.
15 minutes. Okay. So, right. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. The paper that that was published last year is about a concept, I guess, I'm trying to introduce a little bit into the discussion about authoritarian neoliberalism, and it has obviously a very UK specific focus dealing with the role of police in and their interactions, I guess, with welfare institutions. And the paper that you've read, of course, focuses on schools. I'm trying to give a bit of a kind of quick speed run of the paper, so to speak, to get some of the key messages across and give a bit of background as to where that comes from, the project and the paper overall. And I also have brought some additional empirical material, I guess, from another sector, because obviously this paper focuses on schools, but I'm making the argument already there that it is not just about developments in the education sector, but that austerity-driven policification also happens elsewhere. So I have a few figures here and there on mental health care and policing. So in general, I guess the paper is part of a larger project of trying to deepen conversations between criminology, sociology, and critical political economy. That is, I guess, from the kind of disciplinary perspective. From the more real world, empirical, analytical perspective, it is part of a larger conversation I'm trying to engage in that is about post-crisis austerity, the role of policing for that, and what Davy and Koch have called everyday authoritarianism. So how state power, how authoritarian transformations and so on materialize in everyday life. And I think it also relates to then a big question that I think many people in CPRN are engaged with, and that has to do with periodization of neoliberalism, authoritarian neoliberalism, and questions of continuity, shifts, breaks, and how this kind of argument or these kinds of conversations interlace with conversations about, for example, racial capitalism and other ways of trying to make sense of periods of capitalist development in the last decades or so. So that's the general background, and more specifically then, the argument that I'm trying to make in this paper is to say that while we understand austerity as a key development in the UK, and we usually understand it as a key transformation of the UK state in the sense that it cuts capacities of the state to effectively do anything if we are looking at current conversations about the upcoming budgets and questions of investments that are necessary in order to be able to, on the one hand, sustain growth or reignite growth, but on the other hand, also to be able to effectively ensure basic functioning of state institutions. That is pretty much a conversation about cuts and the damage they have done and the reduction of capacities they have resulted in. But I think there's another conversation that is going on there at the same time, or another development that's going on there at the same time, and that is one of strengthening of state power in certain regards. For example, in the area of policing. And my argument is that while austerity is usually understood as reducing state powers, when we look at policing, we can actually see that certain state powers are increased because of austerity. This is largely a development or an argument that is rooted in an observation that has been made for a long time to varying degrees, and Emma has worked on that herself, namely questions of punitive turns, the intensification of coercive capacities in the state, and so on over a long period of time, where the argument is that since the early 90s at the latest, but arguably even before that, the role of policing and so on has increased, the role of prisons and the criminal justice system has increased, and that is related to neoliberalization to some degree. To give a bit of a background to that, there's an argument that neoliberalization, as it looks like and has looked like over the last couple of decades, would not have been possible really without policing and without the police as an institution and actor. Robert Reiner makes this argument quite clearly throughout his work, really, where he says that in the 70s, in the late 1970s, the police entered the stage of politics as a political actor. They campaigned very clearly, directly in electoral terms for Margaret Thatcher, and Margaret Thatcher then also relied quite heavily and leaned on heavily on policing in order to kind of supplement and enforce her economic and political transformations, including by breaking down or not breaking down by clubbing literally the miners and the miner strike, by having police of course clash quite regularly in the 1980s with youth, and especially with black youth throughout inner cities, and by overall starting a kind of law and order campaign that extended far beyond that. Another key point, I guess, in the role and the increasing role of police and logics of policing and criminalization would be that of council estates, which I'm discussing in the paper, how they have over time become seen as, on the one hand, places of stigma, places of the undeserving poor, effectively, and increasingly so also the criminal poor, the disorderly, the dangerous, who have to be kept in check and policed quite significantly. So these observations, I think, are quite well established. Neoliberalization has gone hand in hand with increased reliance on police, crime, law and order. There has been it's an argument that I'm making in the paper as well, that we can trace that back further. We can investigate that argument as such and ask, is this really such a neoliberal development? We can discuss that later, I guess, if we wanted to. But there has then been an argument that there was a certain chance for this type of logic, intensification of policing with neoliberalization, to be broken up. And that was in the early 2010s, when the coalition government came into power and famously committed the country to austerity and to very significant cuts across, well, really the entire span of the state. Scholars at the time, such as Andrew Milley most prominently, have looked at this development at the time and have said, well, if we're considering cuts and if we're looking at what's currently happening, policing in the last couple of years has already widened. Right? We have already seen that police officers are used as social workers, that they're working in schools, that they're doing event security and so on. And if we're now talking about austerity cuts and kind of we need to save, we need to tighten the belt and so on, we need to concentrate on what's really important, what's really necessary. He says that actually would have been a positive opportunity to change this kind of development. This type of neoliberalization goes hand in hand with a bigger reliance on policing. Austerity could be a positive opportunity because it could mean we can get police out of this, out of the council estates, out of schools in which they were to some degree, and therefore we could create a fitter police, more focused on the kind of core task of policing, which is, I guess, in this reading, crime fighting. There's of course a very big question mark to put there if the core task of policing has ever been crime fighting, and I would argue that's not really the case. Policing has always been much more expansive than that, has always had a role to play in welfare and in related tasks. But the argument at the time was austerity might be a positive opportunity. And that, I think, was not necessarily an unreasonable argument to make, because austerity, of course, did mean that cuts to the police happened. The police did shrink. I cite some figures in the paper, but we've seen substantial pay cuts. We have seen substantial cuts in powers as well at the time. For example, with regards to stop and search, we have seen cuts, of course, and that's most prominent, to officer numbers. They have gone down by more than around 20,000 or so at a time. So the argument that maybe the role of policing now changes with austerity, I think, was not an unreasonable argument to make at all at the time. However, when we look at what actually happened, my argument is that the opposite has occurred. Yes, the police has shrunk, but not its role. Its role has always been a wide role, a role of an institution of last resort, and with cuts to the welfare state, to education, as I'm outlining in the paper, but also to mental health provision, to health provision in general, and to the capacities of councils when it comes to questions of housing, social care, and so on. The police have become higher in demand. There's been a higher demand on police as a result of this. So by policification, then, I talk about the increasing role that police are playing in supplementing, assisting, or taking over roles and tasks that previously had been predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly delivered by welfare institutions such as schools, such as the NHS and others. To be sure, the argument here is not that by itself made these institutions coercive, right? My point is not that the welfare state has been completely uncoercive, that there has been no form of pressure, of forms of violence, and so on. But I think it has become more explicit because of an institution that is explicitly focused on these types of techniques and violences. If we look at mental health, maybe starting with that because of time reasons and because of the fact that you have a whole paper on the school aspects, we can, for example, see that police have, since 1744, when the Vagrancy Act was introduced, played some form of role. I'm aware that the institution of the police has gone through various transformations since 1744, but in some form or the other, police institutions have been involved with managing what we might nowadays call mental health cases. The Vagrancy Act obviously did not call it a mental health case. It is still a power, Section 136, that allows police to get involved and to remove people from public spaces, and another provision says police can remove people from private spaces if they are in a particular mental health crisis that requires them to be protected from themselves or to protect others from them. We have seen that this power is being used increasingly. So there are various explanations as to why that's the case. Cultural shifts, we're more aware of it, there are more resources and so on. But I would say if we look into how and when they have developed, this is here the middle part, we see an increase in the late 90s, that's Blair's time, a long period of plateauing, and then a doubling around the financial crisis, and then a tripling in the last decade of austerity. And since COVID, a further rapid increase in more recent times. There's one example of where the police role has been reduced in mental health care, and that is that police stations are not used anymore as places of safety, as places that are designated as safe places for people in mental health crisis to be brought into. But in virtually all other regards in which we measure or can measure police involvement in mental health cases, namely responses to emergency calls received, responses to these emergency calls that are mental health related, the time spent at such calls, the use of police cars to transport people who are detained under Section 136, versus the decrease in ambulances being used to that, which would have been best practice, all appear to me to imply that mental health, that the role of police for the delivery of mental health services has increased significantly. I've brought a couple of illustrations here which show the racial and ethnic dimension of this, but I won't go into this in detail. But what I would like to point out here is that I would, from a kind of perspective of what does this tell us about authoritarian neoliberalism, I think it tells us one or two things that are potentially contradictory. On the one hand, I think it tells us that there is an increase in more overt coercion and state power, right? It's the police, an institution that is not trained, despite a few workshops, in dealing with mental health emergencies. It's an institution that is, for the most part, trained in, well, Nicole Siegel calls it violence work. Yeah, so in arresting people, in applying some form of state violence or the other. So that could be interpreted as an increase in state violence as a result of austerity, and I think that's a valid interpretation. It makes the state stronger. How people experience the state as a result of this is colder, harsher, and so on. At the same time, if we're considering the analysis, for example, by Nikos Poulantzas, and then in the more contemporary versions, I guess, in Ian Bruff's work, we find this kind of strengthening, weakening couple quite well represented here, I would argue. So on the one hand, this type of strengthening, the harsher state, but on the other hand, also a certain degree of undermining of state legitimacy. And I think in the paper, I try to show this with opposition from campaign groups, Sisters Uncut, or from the outrage against the stop and frisk, or the frisk, she wasn't stopped, she was in school, of child Q, who was strip searched in Hackney. That all gets a lot of opposition, and there's, I think, a question, especially in the last couple of years, what the legitimacy of British policing actually still is. I think it's getting from crisis into crisis into crisis, especially the Metropolitan Police. But there's also an internal dimension to this, I would argue, where police officers voice opposition to these developments. And that, I think, is something that's quite visible in mental health. Where police have pushed back significantly, that they think this is really not part of our work. We should not be dealing with mental health cases. We are not trained in this. We are overworked. We are working here as a stopgap. We are picking up the pieces, as a report is called, that police institutions have published. So maybe I end here with one or two remarks there. The response, I think, to this has been to realize it's maybe not a good idea to only have police deal with mental health cases. So what's been tried is to integrate police and other state institutions in street triage teams. That, I think, on the one hand, mitigates the impact of policing in mental health, the most immediate role that it plays. And on the other hand, it normalizes it. There's another interesting example, which is the Right Care, Right Person Act, which maybe speaks more to this weakening dimension that I've talked about to some degree. Namely, that last year in the summer, a couple of police leaders, including the Metropolitan Police, came out and said, we have sought legal advice. We don't actually need to respond to mental health callouts. We don't have a duty of care. We're not an ambulance. We're not a mental health service. We will stop responding to this. Right care, right person here means we are not the right person. And they have demanded the NHS and care providers to attend and step up on their own to address mental health cases. This, I think, speaks a bit to this friction, to this potentially contradictory dimension of the process I'm trying to describe. Schools you have read about, and to briefly end then, I guess what I'm trying to show is how, on the one hand, police is being normalized or are being normalized through this process as just another institution that can do all of these tasks, that can go into schools, that can deal with mental health problems, where that probably should not be the case, simply for reasons of training, if you want to make a very harmless argument. I think we see a transformation of welfare institutions towards more coercion. I think from a conceptual perspective, it shows us that neoliberalization is increasingly reliant on policing, and that has not changed due to austerity, despite the fact that the police were affected by it directly. And I think it is worrying in the context of the current authoritarian legislating that we are seeing about protest policing, obviously about borders, about immigration. All of this, unfortunately, seems to feed into the this overarching development. I think we can ask a couple more questions, but I will leave it here for the moment and let Emma respond, since I think I'm already over my time. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Malte. Yeah, obviously your paper also goes more into detail about this question of schools that you skipped a bit. So like everyone of the attendees, I can again really recommend that you look into it if you haven't read it already. But yeah, now let's give the floor over to Emma.
Hey, thanks very much indeed for that summary, Malte. As I said earlier, I think this article is really an excellent contribution to the ongoing discussion on the coercive face of neoliberalism, and indeed, as you point out, liberalism, perhaps more generally. Perhaps picking up on Domenico Lucerdo's thesis about the coercive face of liberalism vis-a-vis those who were always excluded from the social contract, and of course highlighting that racialized nature of coercion that goes back a very long way. And I certainly, I really, I totally agree with you when you suggest that we need to go beyond the more obvious measurements of punitiveness. Traditionally, I suppose we've looked at prison populations, police numbers, and the penal law. That's what I've done a lot of myself, I suppose. But whilst those are, of course, important, certainly a focus on those measures alone might blind us to looking at what you describe, I think, nicely as a police view of the world that has permeated society more broadly. So although you don't cite them specifically, you seem to offer what Carvalho, Chamberlain and Lewis have described as a holistic conception of punitiveness, which entails defining punitiveness as a phenomenological complex, i.e. a central feature of a range of intersecting experiences and practices operating at a personal, symbolic, political and structural level. And indeed, my own research has led me to shift my initial focus on punitiveness as expressed in the criminal justice system to focus on more subtle forms of authoritarianism in the British state, those forms of authoritarianism that have often been dressed up in the language of liberalism. That's what I termed soft power in my 2015 book on the coalition government, deforming the original way that Joseph Nye used that term soft power to talk about a nation's influence abroad. I looked there at trying to understand how the state might seek to shape and control the behaviour of its own citizens by using more or less subtle forms of coercion, notably in welfare and elsewhere. You use this term, of course, policification, as you show, following Milley, who highlighted how police officers are increasingly called upon to respond to social problems such as mental health issues here, which are necessarily neglected by underfunded social services. Whatever the term used, policification, authoritarian neoliberalism, everyday authoritarianism, it certainly seems that there is now some academic consensus about the fact that the reach of the punitive state is constantly being pushed further into areas of social life that were previously thought to belong to the private sphere or the sphere of social policy. And you focus in particular, indeed, on how policing and welfare institutions have become increasingly intertwined with, as you say, the state police becoming increasingly integrated with other institutions and turned into a key agent in the delivery of welfare and education services. So as a result, social and welfare institutions have become, as you say, more coercive, punitiveness and exclusionary. You make the case very convincingly. I certainly agree. As I say, I've looked myself at how welfare reforms have become increasingly illiberal. I've used the term muscular liberalism to refer to welfare reform. Of course, that was a term that was originally used by David Cameron to talk about his approach to multiculturalism, which entailed using coercive means to force migrants to accept so-called British values, whatever those might be, and to justify the permanent exclusion of those who are seen to reject those values. In welfare policy too, for some time now, we have been able to detect a very strong sense of moral authoritarianism that pits supposedly liberal values of hard work and individual responsibility against the supposedly defective values of benefit claimants. For those who refuse to accept the assistance of state or indeed private sector institutions to inculcate those values and integrate themselves into the labour market, harsh sanctions await. And you rightly point out how in schools, under the guise of providing assistance to young people to divert them from the criminal justice system, police officers are tasked with instilling fundamental societal values into pupils. So perhaps it would appear that that welfare sanction, originally described by David Garland to describe trends at the turn of the last century, has finally come of age as police logics have become firmly embedded in the welfare state. So the example you give of schools is absolutely revelatory. I suppose I wonder a bit about this term policification. Now, trying to be a little bit provocative here, I generally think it is a pretty good term, but it does help to focus our attention not just on overt police power. I see where you're using it. You're saying it policification, it's not just about police power used on the street, but also on more subtle forms of power and policing logics that go beyond the exercise of brute force. I just wonder that maybe it might run counter to your aim to encourage us to adopt a holistic view of punitiveness. Of course, the idea of policification here, as I understand it, it might help to shift the focus beyond the police as an institution towards the ways in which social problems might be framed through a policing lens. But I also wonder if maybe there is a risk that the use of the term might have the opposite effect and direct attention away from the other individuals and institutions that might assume policing functions and diffuse state power more deeply throughout civil society. So I wonder perhaps maybe if the term allows us to focus enough on private for-profit actors, whether they are performing more traditional security functions, or of course we have had a proliferation of private actors involved in applying welfare sanctions, for example, as well. Does it encourage us to think enough about the individual citizens who take on policing roles? We might think of the teachers who are encouraged to report their students who are supposedly at risk of extremism to the Prevent programme, of landlords who are now obliged to check the immigration status of future tenants, or citizens who are encouraged to report illegal migrants to the authorities. So it's just that the idea of that, police in that term, does it focus attention too much maybe on the police and maybe not enough attention on those other actors that take on these policing functions? Also, I suppose then, why is policification a better term then than other terms that have been used in the past? Simply social control, authoritarianism, authoritarian populism, or perhaps more precisely neoliberal authoritarian populism. Indeed, perhaps that latter term is particularly useful authoritarian, neoliberal authoritarian populism is maybe particularly useful to the extent that it draws more attention maybe to the issue of statecraft. And you do mention statecraft in your paper, but I was wondering if it might be useful to have a term that not only highlights the authoritarian direction of the British state, but simultaneously encourages us to reflect on exactly why that is happening. So you're suggesting that austerity is driving an intensification of pre-existing liberal, then neoliberal trends towards punitiveness. And if I've understood you correctly, really, you're saying that austerity-driven policification, it's driven by austerity in social policy, not it still happens despite whether there's austerity in policing or not, doesn't matter. It's the austerity in policing, it's the austerity in social policy that means that you need this increased policing. And you show very clearly how the state deliberately exacerbates social problems such as food and housing insecurity through austerity policies, and then intensifies and then it identifies those same problems as risk factors that justify policing interventions in schools and housing estates of deprived areas. So, I also agree with you that it's important to debunk that optimistic scenario according to which austerity measures imposed upon the police lead to the de-escalation of policing. As you quite rightly say, defunding does not equate with abolition. And this encourages us to think in a much more constructive way about what defunding the police would entail in practice, which is, of course, the very opposite of austerity, a massive injection of state funding into social institutions. So obviously here, I mean, it's beyond the scope of your paper, I think, to go into the statecraft here, but maybe you might be able to tell us a little bit more about this afterwards, how exactly policification works as populist statecraft, particularly, and maybe talk a little bit more. You mentioned, you cite Neoclaus in your paper about the need for pacification, social pacification, at the present time. I also wonder if you could tell us maybe a bit more about how policification works to transfer more wealth and power to the private sector, which is, of course, a key aspect of neoliberalism, particularly the private security industry, and particularly in the concept of austerity. In your article, you mentioned the use of CCTV in schools, which is presumably something that benefits the private sector above all. And you note that the state police had become increasingly integrated with other institutions and turned into a key agent in the delivery of welfare and education services. I was wondering what role is there for the private sector as partners there in the delivery of these welfare and education services. You also make a really good point when you note that the more coercive and violent the state has become, the more it is opened up to critique and contestation. And this, of course, in turn encourages yet more coercion on the part of the state, as we have seen with the increased criminalisation of protest, particularly in the wake of recent protests by climate change movements and by the Black Lives Matter movement that seeks specifically to contest racialized state authoritarianism. And in such a context, I wonder if there is any reason for optimism that this response will lead to a legitimacy crisis for the British state and ultimately for authoritarian neoliberalism. I suppose maybe I'm less optimistic that there's going to be a legitimacy crisis when we see the state just ratcheting up its authoritarian reaction in response to any kind of contestation. And I suppose that leads me to a final question regarding the inflection that policies might be taking at the minute under a Labour government, which is, of course, committed to pursuing austerity. all the signs we've seen so far, depressingly, seem to point to continued authoritarianism. We saw in the wake of the racist violence this summer, Starmer responded by promising to set up a standing army of specialist police to increase facial recognition technology, shared intelligence, and to strengthen criminal behaviour orders. The focus was not on tackling the climate of racism in which far-right activity has flourished. The riots have also helped to legitimise the continuation of draconian anti-protest legislation, which shows no signs of being repealed. And of course, with regard to immigration, the government has proposed yet another law on immigration, the Border Security, Asylum and Immigration Bill, that was announced in the King's Speech last July, that seeks to apply counter-terror powers to the immigration system, ostensibly to tackle organised immigration crime. This is despite the fact that there are significant concerns that those powers might facilitate even harsher treatment of migrants who are sometimes coerced into policing small boats across the Channel. Furthermore, in continuity with the previous government, Labour has made no effort to vaunt the advantages of immigration, indeed assimilating controlling immigration with efforts to make our streets safer. And of course, we saw a very blatant illustration of anti-immigration populism with Starmer's recent visit to meet with the Italian far right to discuss such policies. And the King's Speech also announced that legislation will be brought forward to strengthen community policing. And this is, of course, something you identify in your paper as propelling the policification, drives towards policification in schools. And furthermore, perhaps we might be likely to see an intensification on trends towards the policification of social policy, given that Labour will be particularly concerned about the political need, maybe, to dress its authoritarianism up as liberalism, and to try to show that there is some kind of difference between it and the last Conservative government. Maybe will the coercive face perhaps be less obvious as it was maybe under New Labour, but not less coercive for that. And of course, it seems that continued austerity then is probably likely to drive further policification as the government feels the need to be seen to be doing something about the social fallout that will ensue. And it was really interesting to see that one of the last points you made there about the pushback from the police when it comes to dealing with mental health problems, and saying, this isn't our responsibility. I wonder if you see maybe a very surprising source of optimism there, that there might be some kind of pushback against these trends in policification, that maybe if these come from within, from the police themselves, that might have some impact in reversing these trends, more so even maybe than the protest movements that have emerged to fight against them. So there's lots and lots there. Of course, don't feel free to answer anything you want. I mean, I just wanted to try and get the conversation going.
Thanks a lot, Emma. Many really intriguing points you're raising there. So yeah, for now, we can launch into the Q&A phase as well. So yeah, people can use the Q&A function to type in their questions, and I'll read them to you. But while you're doing that, I'm also really intrigued to hear Malte's response right out of the gate to some of these points. So why don't you start with that?
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much, Emma, for your engagement with the paper, and for your provocations and questions, which I think are all very relevant, very legitimate, and very difficult to answer. So I've tried to keep track of the questions. So I'll try to have a shot at them. If I've left something out that you think really needs clarification, please let me know. I think starting with the conceptual question, so why policification isn't another term maybe better, or isn't the term even counterproductive? The initial idea to call this policification, or the motivation behind that, was actually not to go holistic in the understanding of authoritarianism. The initial idea was to say, we're doing this, and we're very right to do this. And I will also not say that I'm trying the opposite or something like that. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to zoom in and zoom in on a specific institution of the modern state that has a special role within it, and that is the police, right? It is the institution of last resort, as Egon Bittner has called that in the 70s. It is the institution that, in effect, can do whatever the state needs it to do, as we are seeing, right? It can be sent into schools. It can be sent out to mental health emergencies. It can also be sent out to shoot a terrorist, and it can try and solve your I don't know, a burglary or something like that, and literally anything in between. So I think that is significant. That is important. There is still something qualitatively different if you're dealing with a police officer and the institution of the police than if you're dealing with a local council officer, which doesn't mean that the local council officer is necessarily a very friendly, supportive, and whatnot person who works in an always supportive and, I don't know, based on solidarity, an institution based on solidarity or so. But I think there's a bit of a qualitative difference. So that was the initial idea. Focus on the police, show how this specific institution has transformed and has integrated, changed, and so on in the more holistic context of punitiveness and so on that you have outlined. With regards to authoritarian neoliberalism or authoritarian neoliberal populism and related concepts, I think it's not operating on the same level of abstraction and of explanation. I think authoritarian neoliberalism is a much wider process that we're seeing, and I would argue policification is one of them, and it's at least one of them in the UK context. Might look similar in others. There's also I'm German, as you will probably hear, so there's a lot in terms of protest legislation and immigration debate, obviously, that is very similar to what has been going on in the UK. But I would argue that there still is a slight difference in how police are put to work, so to speak, in both countries. And policification, to me, seems to be more descriptive of the austerity environment, the austerity polity, I guess, that the UK is, according to people like Bob Jessup, for example, where austerity becomes this organizing principle for everything. And within that context, I think the police are important. You made a point that my argument is that austerity in social policy is really what's driving this, and that austerity in the police or in the institution of the police is not as relevant. And I see why you're making that point, but I would still argue that it's not entirely accurate. I think it's true that the cutting of the institutions such as schools, NHS, and so on is, so to speak, the bigger problem. But in particular, when we're talking about legitimacy question and questions of where's pushback coming from, where are fault lines, where is debate and discussion, where's discontent, I think the austerity in the police is very important. On the one hand, for reasons, I guess, of popular appeal, the defunding of police and abolition argument is simply not very popular in the broader public, and the idea that police would be cut, people associate that still with increases in insecurity, or decrease of security, I should have said, with higher crime and so on, despite the fact that it's very often simply not borne out by any data that is really true, this kind of connection. So I think from that perspective, that's important because it helps justify more authoritarianism, more coercion, and so on. And then the other thing you mentioned at the end, this kind of pushback that we see, at least when it comes to mental health cases, from within the police, who say this is really not what we are supposed to be doing. This is something for someone else. We're pulling out of this now. There, I think it is important because it leads to some transformations, and I will say a bit more about if I think that that's actually making things better or not. And then I think there's a third point, which is the no, I'm messing myself up with my own terminology. The politicization of the police. So the police as a political actor, which this is not necessarily the focus of my work, but as I said in my little talk, someone like Robert Reiner is making this case for ages that the police are becoming and have become an important political actor, electorally political actor. They associate themselves traditionally with the Conservatives, with New Labour as well, and now we have seen this break, and I think that break is quite real and has had some impact. That is partially, I think, why the police are now, or why the New Labour government now is so accommodating to police, because there is simply a huge amount of pressure coming out of police institutions that more powers are needed, that they need to react, that they need to get money, and that I think is to a large degree a result from austerity cuts to the police. You mentioned abolition and defunding. I would simply associate myself with what you said. What does abolition look like? What does defunding mean? Well, in the end, defunding means funding, but for other things. And so putting substantial investment into, I guess, what we traditionally call the welfare state would be the first step towards this. And I'm afraid we're not necessarily seeing that at the moment, as you've described yourself. We will see. I mean, the budget, I guess, is coming out, but I don't think that we will see a massive U-turn. I will have to think a bit more about the point you made about transfer of power and money to the private sector, because my focus has very much been the state police and not in detail interactions between the police and the private sector, though of course there are many. You mentioned CCTV, we can talk about other equipment and technology and so on. We can talk about private security personnel that's being used and effectively fulfills a similar role. Many people I'm coming back to mental health cases because I guess that's where I'm trying to take this conversation. So I'm sorry if I confused people too much with my talking more about mental health than about schools. When we consider how many areas and how public space is often policed, a lot of this is obviously through private police services. They are very often as is the state police, a first point of contact for people who are, for example, rough sleepers or who are experiencing a mental health episode in public. So, of course, the more private security personnel we have, the more or the bigger their role will become in dealing with these kinds of incidents and roles. I guess the last question that you raised is the most difficult one. Are there reasons for optimism? I mean, you made a whole list of where there are no reasons for optimism. Mainly.
Sorry, I tend to do this.
Yeah, me too. mainly relating to Starmer and the new government. I have a hard time to say no, you're wrong. You should see it the other way. I think what is true is that in 2020 or so, with the movement for Black Lives, with the general defunding conversations or so, they have certainly died down in intensity, but I think a lot of movement building, a lot of research, not least, and a lot of just kind of spreading of awareness or so has happened and continues to happen. The conversation still exists. It is there, which is an improvement, I would argue, to 6 years ago or something like that. So I think there's generally a bit more awareness. I would not expect that these things will now change fundamentally. I think in the UK, it's very clear that the Starmer government is not in government because of a big program of change, right? Yes, change from the Conservatives, but not necessarily change in terms of the approach to immigration or anything related to that. And given the apparent, at least, commitment to more austerity, I think they will find themselves caught in this type of spiral that I'm trying to describe and that you summarized very well, namely austerity means reduction in capacities. These capacities are filled by the police. That raises legitimacy question. That requires a harsher state response. That leads to less legitimacy, and so on and so forth. It would really be a good thing to break out of that. And I think the first step towards that would be to take a step away from austerity and to offer something else than coercion, toughness, from the perspective of the state, right? To effectively tell a positive story of what the state can be and can look like. If we're seeing that at some point, then I would be a bit more optimistic. I don't think we're seeing it currently.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, it seems that it's just a spiral. I mean, Hayek talked about the ratchet effect of socialism. I think probably we can talk about the ratchet effect of neoliberalism, and the more coercive the state becomes, it becomes almost impossible for it to get out of that spiral. It's a constant intensification, it would seem, really, at the minute. I suppose, yeah, maybe there is, I agree with what you say, that maybe there is some hope for optimism. I mean, the discussions that are being had about things like defunding the police that simply didn't really exist a few years ago, that they are there. And I suppose if there's to be some optimism, I suppose it comes down to strategy and how you frame those issues. You know, you say defund the police isn't popular. No, if you just, yeah, most people, I think, the general public doesn't really understand what defund the police really means. Maybe it's not a particularly useful slogan at the end of the day. Yeah. But if you have that debate with people, I suppose, about what are the police for, I think probably the vast majority of people would think that the police are not there to deal with social problems like mental health issues. There's certainly a lot of contestation about police in schools, I suppose. I don't know really about the UK. I know that this is something that has been discussed a bit in France, about the police presence in schools, and has been very, very much resisted. What about the resistance from teaching staff, etc., in the UK to those trends?
So I would refer to Remy Joseph Salisbury's work on that, and Laura Connolly, who have done some studies in UK schools and have talked to teachers. I'm citing them at a couple of points in the paper, and I think what they're showing is that kind of both exists. There are some people who do embrace it and see it as teachers and see it as a kind of useful addition to their own services, I guess, their own role as teachers and pedagogues. But there are many who reject it and say it is criminalizing, and it is also kind of trespassing. We are not just teachers who are who are conveying knowledge or so, but we're also trying to convey how do you behave, how do you solve conflicts, what do you do when someone steps over the line, right? We don't need police to deal with the types of conflicts that we're dealing with here in school. Like, if we need them, we can still call them effectively, right? But we don't need them here as as a kind of standard option, because it criminalizes our students and it criminalizes us as a school as a whole. I think that's an argument that comes through there quite frequently, right? As soon as you have one of these officers, you're considered to be a problematic school, potentially a dangerous school, and that's something that many teachers, of course, don't want. I think in terms of public opposition to this, I think the strongest this was really after the strip search of this child Q, a black girl who was strip searched in school without an adult. Obviously the police officers were adults, but without any other adult present, and knowing that she was on her period at the same time. That caused quite a bit of outrage. And on the back of that, I think it connected as well with wider police scandals, of which we had a few in the UK. I'm not necessarily confident to say that this is a topic that's very high on the agenda, though, in terms of public attention that's being paid to it.
Yeah. And maybe just a quick comment on what you said. You said you didn't actually intend to offer this holistic approach. You said I totally get what you mean. The focus is specifically on the police. Yeah, okay, very convincing.
I have no
justification
problem
for
with
using,
it, right?
using the term. But I think your paper does do more than what you set out to do. Actually, that idea of things being viewed through a policing lens, I think it gets us to think intentionally or not, it gets us to think about things in a more holistic way, which is useful.
Yeah, so I'm obviously not against these conversations, right? So the point was not to offer something that we should do instead. As I tried to say, I try to offer a bit of a zoom in of a larger conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
You can see we actually have a question coming up now from Ian, who's asking you, Malte, if you've seen the talk of around ending worklessness this week as part of the continuities between the last governments and the new one. Plus, how someone like Wes Streeting describes health policy as economic policy in support of growth, very ordoliberal way.
Yeah, hi Ian. You're calling me out to some degree because I've spent my week over lecture slides that I've prepared for next week, so I'm not sure if I'm completely up to date on the talk about ending worklessness. What seems to me what looking, I guess, at current political developments of the last weeks, let's say, or month or so since Labour is in government again, it does not seem to strike me as a situation where a government takes over and says, and now things will change fundamentally. Right? We have a lot of conversation about, and I think Emma, you mentioned this as well, right? You said things might get more coercive, but maybe not as obviously so, right? Maybe not as obvious as under Tony Blair, or maybe also not as obvious now as in the last 2 years or so under the Tories, but it might still happen. And I have the impression that we're seeing this throughout fields of this new government, that yes, we have a change in style, we have a change in rhetoric, we have everything seems more appropriate, less scandalous, less obviously crazy, I guess. But when it comes to actual change, actual policy change, the big theme is hard decisions, tough decisions. We need to prepare ourselves for, I don't know, stormy weather, these kinds of conversations that we have been having for ages. And so in that regard, this doing less with more, getting people into work, getting people into work in the sense of encouraging, I guess, people to take on whatever work in order to in order to address, I guess, social issues in the end, seems to me fairly continuous. I'm sure I've butchered this answer quite a bit to you, Ian, but apologies to not following the latest news as much as I probably should have before this talk.
Maybe to follow up on this from my side, it struck me a bit that you highlighted like how much this whole issue of policification is not really much on people's agenda, which I find interesting considering like how major some of the clashes with police and activists have also been over at least like the past year or two. But I suppose that links into this general question of, okay, is it an issue that is particularly visible for people on the left and particularly visible for people who are already kind of on board with questions of defunding, rather than the general public? Which I guess that might be one of the differences to France, I suppose, where that you mentioned, Emma, where the police are just very present, but they're also very militarized. They carry guns around. Like their presence, I feel like is perhaps a bit more felt and a bit more aggressive in that sense. So maybe that's one of the reasons there's this difference there. But I'm just kind of wondering in regard to this policification, who is actually in favor? Like among the electorate, like to what extent are people like who would actually welcome this change to have police in schools? So I'm never really quite clear on this, in general, and then in the case of the UK in particular.
I mean, I mean, I don't know as much about France, but I guess the comparison might be interesting because of how or what kind of role police play for the national perception, self-perception or so, right? So historically, I guess British police have been very close to an idea of Britishness, right? The unarmed bobby on the beat, the best of British values and British characteristics, also reasonable, helpful, and so on. And I think that has a quite long-lasting effect. I've noticed when during the Olympics, the London Olympics, so some years ago, they had this little mascot, this kind of one-eyed weird creature. It was called Wenlock, and you could buy Wenlock as a police officer, right? So with like a custodian helmet on and like a baton and so on. I think you see. I don't think you would see that necessarily in France, for example. I also don't think you would see that in Germany, right? So the police would have very different connotations, and I think here in the UK it plays a bigger role for the kind of national identity or so, where it's generally considered as something that's very typically British and generally harmless since unarmed and different to continental militarized police forces. So I think we're starting from a different basis. And on top of that, I think comes a huge amount of law and order that has simply been normalized. That the answer more police is generally an accepted answer because problems are portrayed almost by default as problems of crime or insecurity that can be addressed that way, right? Schools are hotbeds of people who are, I don't know, carrying knives, using all kinds of using all kinds of drugs, are in gangs, and therefore it is a reasonable thing to create more security by relying on police. I think that's I think one of the kind of dynamics mechanisms that is underpinning that. And I think who is against it or who's really for that, it's an interesting question. I think we're on some level almost working on the level of effect. It is the kind of reasonable, natural thing to do. It's not even questioned as much anymore, because of the normalization of, yeah, everything is a crime problem, and if everything is a crime problem, then conventional wisdom has it police are the solution to it.
Right. Thanks a lot. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions on the site. But yeah, I think we've had a rich discussion already. I'm giving the floor back to you if you have any final comments or any final reflections coming out of this.
Sorry, to whom? To me or to Emma?
Both of you.
totally agree with your answer to the last question, and it seems that myth of policing by consent really is all pervasive, and hence it seems so very shocking when we see some of the scandals that have been revealed, for example, in the Met. Nobody can quite believe this. This is an aberration. In the normal, compared to the way that the police is meant to function in Britain. So yeah, absolutely, it's very hard to get over that. And when but yeah, I think you've covered like loads of what. Trying to see if there's anything else that I picked up on. I don't know. Malte, have you got anything else to add? I don't know.
No,
I suppose what was UK specific about this, was the thing. So I suppose we've mentioned the police. That's very much that that myth of the myth of policing by consent, and that is a specificity to the UK. Is there anything else really that you can think of that is particularly specific about this? I mean, your focus has been on the UK. Is this something? I mean, I think in the United States probably there has been a similar level of policification in education. Are there any other examples you've come across? I'm not sure.
I think with regards to the US, the situation is much more extreme. So it is what we're seeing here at much higher levels. This is where, I mean, a lot of the literature on school policing is American. The UK literature is still relatively limited. I mentioned this in the paper. There's certainly work on it, but if we compare this to work on school policing in the US, it's thwarted by that. That is also where arguments about school to prison pipelines and so on come from, right? Where every single misdemeanor, I guess, in school is criminalized and dealt with by police and potentially done with the prison system quite quickly. So from that perspective, I don't think we're operating on the same level or experiencing the same level as in the US. But at the same time, if we're moving in one direction, then that we're implementing more and more of these types of logics, and indeed not only logics, but also then policies, such as bringing more officers into schools that are most seen there. What I think is British about this, apart from what we just discussed, is I think the unique commitment, certainly at least if we compare it to other European countries, the unique commitment and almost voluntary in the sense of not forced by international institutions or so, of the government, subsequent government, to austerity, that this continues and is on some level self-inflicted, that it isn't, or hasn't been the case, for example, in Greece. Greece is obviously also committed to massive austerity measures, but as we know, not because the Greek government decided this. This was the way to go by itself. In the UK, there seems to be much more voluntary or much more voluntary dimension to this compared to other countries. And I think that paired with this, the aspect of policing by consent, of law and order that we have seen, and the devastating effects of austerity in social care and overall in social policy, rather, make this story of policification, I think, quite British in the end. Which is not to say that we aren't observing an increase in police powers in other countries, but I think the intricacies of these are quite unique in that. Yeah, I think there's almost a sad part of it, right? I mean, there are many sad parts about this, but it's almost the saddest part about it, because I think an alternative would be fairly easy to imagine, right? It has largely to do, from my perspective anyway, it has largely to do with state investment. That wouldn't create a communist utopia or anything like that, but it would certainly help in reducing the reliance and increasing reliance on a very coercive state institution that simply is not necessary. That I think is, there's a certain dimension of uniqueness to this. But yeah, I also I don't want to keep people for further speculation. So from my perspective, I think this has also been a very rich discussion, very interesting discussion. Thank you very much, Emma, for your comments and for your engagement, and Bernd for setting it up. So
Right.
I hope it was interesting.
Thank you very much. It's been great. I've really enjoyed the discussion with you. Thank you, and thanks to Bernd as well. Yeah.
Thanks a lot to both of you. And yeah, again, sorry for the tech issues, but yeah, I agree. This has been great, and yeah, I'm sure everyone got a lot out of it as well. So yeah, again, thanks a lot, and hopefully see you all again soon at a CPRN event or otherwise.
Let's hope so. Thank you very much, and thanks to the audience as well. And
yeah, thanks, sir, and thanks everyone for coming.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
See ya.